Here today is Ryan Boldt. There you go. Ryan is the lead geneticist for IGS. So when it comes to digging in the database, looking at ways to create solutions, Ryan is our go-to man. He oversees the populations of all 20-odd breed societies and individual breeders around the country, around the world, excuse me. Ryan comes from a sheep background and is doing a lot of research at Colorado State University. He was the head of genetics at the Red Angus Association of America before being elevated into this position where he oversees all the different breeds. So we've got a great opportunity today to talk to Ryan about research EPDs, the new research he's doing, and then we'll try to get some questions in if you have specifics. Now, I don't think he's in a position, if you've got a question about a particular bullet sitting at your house today, but he can answer some pretty overarching questions for you. So Ryan, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Luke. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you remotely. And so we'll go ahead and jump right in here. So today, kind of what I'm planning on talking about is some of the new trait development that we've been working on kind of in the R&D phases in terms of these traits, but been making some really good progress and going to kind of report some of that progress back to you. And so for those of you that may not be aware or weren't in attendance for previous IGS meetings, kind of the three main new traits that we're working on include mature weight, dry matter intake, and heifer pregnancy. And so a lot of my presentation today will be on these three things and kind of digging into some of the details and some of the things we've learned as of more recently in regards to each of these different traits. And so to kind of begin to give you guys a little bit of a scope of what the EPD development process looks like on the IGS side. So we kind of go through different steps or this, I guess, pictorial representation of different steps that we take in terms of working through the new trait development process. And so as we think about those things, a lot of those first initial steps, obviously we need to define the trait or think about the trait that we're trying to create a genetic prediction for. Then we go through the variance component estimation step and model definition. So that's picking out what different types of effects we want to include in that genetic evaluation, what the contemporary groups for that specific trait are going to look like, and things of that nature. Then from there, we reach out to all the different IGS partner organizations and try to get data that they have within their database, kind of, I guess, collected with us at IGS. And so we can work on some of the development process. And the first part of that development process is the data preparation. And so as many of you guys probably know, breed association data sets take a little bit of massaging to get into workable formats. And so that's a really important and vital step of all of the genetic evaluations processes is to make sure that data is in a format that we can use within a genetic evaluation. Once we get from there, then kind of the more in-depth development side starts coming into hand. And so kind of the way we first start is we first develop a pedigree blup, so no genomics, just a traditional pedigree analysis that we're used to having. We run that through a validation. And so our validation process, many of those, we've got multiple different approaches that we take for the validation process, which includes both a linear regression approach as well as a removal of phenotypes and correlations to those removed phenotypes. After that, first initial model makes it through this validation stage. Then we go through our second phase of development, which is incorporating that into a single step genetic evaluation. Again, we run through a similar validation procedure, and then we begin the testing process. And so this testing process is multiple kind of faceted, I will say. That's not only from our side, just testing automation and things of that nature, making sure that the evaluation is running and behaving as we would expect, but also from each of the individual partner organizations, taking a look over, letting us know any questions that they have, and providing feedback on that information. Once we get through that, then that's when we have moved to a point where we're ready to implement that in our production set of EPDs. So that's the set of EPDs that get produced every week as part of the genetic evaluation, and then we'll be there from each week forward. And so for each of these new traits that we're talking about here, they all go through this same general process in terms of the different steps that we want to go through prior to making that an official published IGS EPD. The next, to kind of jump in here, I'm going to first start with mature weight, which is the trait I've spent a majority of my time over the last couple of months and still have been working on, kind of working towards some of the initial work in that. And so as we think about mature weight and kind of some of the economic importance of that trait, mature weight is a bit interesting because it's kind of two-sided in terms of its economic importance. We have a side where that is a revenue source in terms of salvage value of those animals. So once that female is no longer in the herd, that salvage value of that female is positive. However, we also have a negative side in terms of our maintenance energy costs or cost to maintain body condition score within those females. And not only that, an indirect cost as well as mature weight can potentially have an influence in terms of our stocking density if we have a fixed land mass. And so as we kind of look at each of these different aspects, I pulled together some pricing data in terms of what that looks like, kind of here for US prices over a 5-year stretch, kind of ending in 2021. So my graph here in the top right hand of the screen is the all hay price. And so that includes both grass hay and alfalfa, a combination of those. And so if we look kind of from January of 2017 to January of 2022, we see roughly an increase in that. We do see kind of some variations in that, but generally you would say that trend over time is increasing. As we look down here below that graph, for our utility cow price, which that's one of the metrics in terms of cull cows, there's utility cows and then cutter canner cows. And the utility cows generally are the nicer cull cows. We see that price is kind of, I mean, if you look at that, kind of remained relatively flat. And so as we think about mature weight and we think about some of our selection decisions in terms of mature weight, we see that our input prices are gradually increasing here. However, our revenue from the other side is not increasing at the same rate. However, when we look at genetic trends, and I just pulled a general genetic trend, but it would be pretty similar for most breed associations, that we see a gradual increase for mature weight over time. And a lot of this is caused by genetic correlations, which are often quite strong to earlier in life growth traits such as weaning weight and yearling weight. A lot of selection pressure over, the last several decades have been within breed association been put on positively influencing those growth traits. And so as we think about that, that's had a ramification of increasing mature weights over time. And so as we think about mature weight within economic selection indexes as well, that often acts as kind of the counterbalance to some of those earlier in life growth traits. And so as we think about the phenotypes that we're using within this genetic evaluation, obviously being a mature weight genetic evaluation, we're going to have those mature weights of females that are collected on individuals that are greater than 2 years of age. We also need, with our approach, a coinciding body condition score to go along with that. And so the reason that we need this body condition score is so that we can adjust these observations to a common body condition score across all females. And then as far as correlated traits within that genetic evaluation, we have weaning weight and post-weaning gain to help kind of inform the evaluation, because we get much more of those observations, but B, it also helps us to correct for selection bias in those females that we do see have mature weight observations. And so in terms of body condition score, we're using the BIF body condition scoring guidelines of 1 to 9, where a 1 is an extremely emaciated female and a 9 is an extremely fat female. And that within that kind of a range of 5 or 6 is kind of considered to be ideal. As we look at the mature weight observations, or kind of our data structure in terms of the mature weight observations, I've got a graph here that represents the y-axis represents the count of the number of observations, and the x-axis represents the age. So here we see that we have roughly a little less than 25,000 mature weight observations on 2-year-old females, and this drops down to roughly 500 or so on 12-year-old females, with kind of a decreasing trend over time. And so this is the data set that I've been using in terms of variance component estimation for these traits. And so this will kind of help you guys get an idea of what some of that data structure looks like. So one of the first steps that I worked through in terms of working on this was to estimate variance components or heritability estimates for each of our mature weight at each of the different ages. So in these graphs here, the x-axis both represents an age, and then the y-axis on the left side graph is variance, and the right graph is the heritability estimates. And so kind of the main takeaway from this is, as we look at some of those variance components and heritability estimates, that we see those are generally increasing until 6 years of age, especially as we look at our phenotypic variance and our genetic variance. And at that point, we start to see that kind of taper off. We see here over on heritability, this graph is a bit misleading because the range of it is pretty small, but we're getting estimates of heritability, at least on the single trait side, ranging anywhere from 0.45 to low 0.28, 0.29 levels there. So fairly high heritability in terms of many of the traits that we have under selection. They would be actually north of most of the early in life growth traits in terms of their heritability. The next part that I worked through was running bivariate analyses between each of the different ages from 2 to 6 years of age. Really kind of our takeaway from the first side, or from the first kind of analysis, was because our maximum amount of genetic variation was at that 6 years of age, that's the age that we are going to want to predict to in terms of an EPD. And so prior to that, we want to look at genetic correlations, or what are the genetic relationships between those earlier measures, so ages 2, 3, 4, and 5, to that age 6 and among each other. And so as we look across here, my third column within this table are our genetic correlations. These represent confidence intervals for those genetic correlations. Our residual correlations here is our kind of environmental effects between each of those different observations, and then again the confidence interval for that residual correlations. So as we look across here within this data set, genetic correlations are generally pretty high, ranging from the high 0.7s to high 0.8s, depending on kind of what I guess pair of trait combinations you want to look at. And so really we can see that even younger measures of mature weight are really good predictors of older measures of mature weight. So what that means is generally if females are larger at 2 years of age, they tend to be larger at 6 years or in successive ages after that. And so that was good because that allows us to kind of simplify the model or take kind of a simpler approach to the way that we want to look at this versus having to fit each of these traits individually and really kind of exponentially increasing the size of that genetic evaluation, which leads to really long run times in terms of that evaluation. Kind of the final step here that I went through is just looking at the genetic relationship between this age 6 and weaning weight and post-weaning gain, which is, like I said earlier, kind of our indicator traits or our correlated traits that we're going to fit within the genetic evaluation. And so here again, we see above the diagonals represent our genetic correlations, below the diagonals represent the residual correlations. And really, as you look across this table here, we see that genetic correlations to weaning weight and post-weaning gain within this subset of data is very strong. We see 0.6 correlation between mature weight at age 6 and a 0.5 correlation between post-weaning gain and mature weight at age 6. And so what that signifies is that both weaning weight and post-weaning gain are going to be very strong and very influential correlated traits within that genetic evaluation. And so that's good because that's a lot of data, or we have the largest amount of data, most notably on weaning weight. As we kind of break down and put all of this into effect or kind of move towards more of the genetic evaluation side, the genetic evaluation model that we're going to fit for this is a 3-trait model. And so that's what I've got represented within the, I guess, the matrix equation here on the screen. And so each of those are Y variables, are observations for mature weight, weaning weight, and post-weaning gain. Then we're going to have fixed effects. So our fixed effects for mature weight would be our body condition score, which is being fit as a deviation from the body condition score of 5. A mature weight contemporary group, which is comprised of the birth information of the dam, as well as the calf the weaning contemporary group of the calf that she has when the mature weight was recorded, as well as breed effects and outcross covariates. For weaning weight and yearling weight, we're going to fit similar effects to what we fit in our growth genetic evaluation. And so a lot of those observations are pre-adjusted for some of the effects included for mature weight. So those will only include fixed effects would be the contemporary groups respectively for those traits. And then obviously random effects, we are only fitting direct genetic effects for this trait, no maternal effects are included in this model. And so what this all means is that our units for our EPD are going to be the differences in mature weight expressed in pounds for a 6-year-old female at a body condition score of 5. And so a lot of traditional mature weight evaluations don't have that level of clarity to them in terms of their definition. If you look at the definition, generally it's kind of differences in mature weight is how they would generally be described, and they would be related to the means fit, which aren't always known. And so we're trying to kind of make that pretty concrete in terms of our definition for that trait. The other side of this, and something that we're kind of working on as we get a little bit farther into the development side, is also not only publishing this EPD in terms of differences in weight, but also in terms of other units as well. So different number of pounds of feed, megacalories of energy, several different options using NRC equations for this. So kind of going forward, still have a few more runs for variance components to finish up, and then working on kind of the prototyping, or the second half of that graphic that I showed you on the second slide. And then obviously from the partner organizations have to work on getting uploads finalized, as well as the research into alternative units. Next, kind of I'll hit on dry matter intake and some of the work that's been done there. And so again, as we think about dry matter intake and some of its economic importance, it's really the cost of gain or the cost of feed that is provided to the animal in order to make it be able to grow during that post-weaning growth phase within a feedlot. Again, as we look here, the graph on the right represents an Omaha corn price, which is an overall corn price. We see that was a little bit stagnant there from 2017 to 2020. But here over the last couple of years, at least in the US, we've seen a gradual increase in that price over time. And so again, something that's important in terms of economics, especially to the feedlot side of the business here in the US. Down here on the bottom left of my slide, I have another generalized genetic trend where we see that the genetic trend for dry matter intake is increasing. And again, a lot of this is due to similar reasons for mature weight, is earlier in life growth traits are positively correlated with dry matter intake. And so continued selection pressure for increases in those has increased those trends for dry matter intake. One of the common questions that comes up when talking about DMI or RFI or RADG, there's kind of several different variations of traits that kind of select or that focus around the feed efficiency area. I won't go through and read all of this, but kind of give you a general synopsis. And so this actually comes directly from the BIF guidelines on dry matter intake, or the feed intake section. If you want to go back and review that, definitely encourage you to do that. Excellent resource in terms of this. And so kind of their reasoning or their thoughts on this topic is that in terms of selection for more feed efficiency, the dry matter intake is the economically relevant trait, and the most efficient way to do that, or to select for more profit in regards to feed intake relative to gain, is to do that via an economic selection index. And so that's definitely, the route that we're going to go down in terms of the development of this EPD, is to provide a DMI EPD, because that is the ERT, and then allow economic selection indexes to weight appropriately the trade-offs between cost of gain and additional pounds of gain relative to other traits that are important to overall profitability. So obviously, with the dry matter intake EPD, the phenotypes that we're using for that genetic evaluation are dry matter intake records. which are collected via individual feed testing stations. So that may be something like a grow safe unit or CLOC. Also kind of recommendations for those are similar to BIF guidelines. Test animals within one feed intake test should generally be born within 60 days of one another. Animals should be at least 240 days of age and less than 390 coming off test. BIF recommends a 21-day warm-up period prior to the start of the test, and then a minimum of 42-day testing period to collect dry matter intake information. And so that's actually one of the advantages of DMI over other metrics as well, is we are able to shorten up the testing period from a feed intake standpoint, because we're not trying to get, or we use metrics of growth during the post-weaning phase, so weaning weight and yearling weight to be our metric in terms of growth. And so we can actually shorten up that testing period and allow more animals to be tested within a year. Similarly to mature weight, we will use weaning weight and post-weaning gain as our correlated traits because they have strong genetic correlations to dry matter intake. And so working through some of the variance components, we've actually kind of come up with two options that are fairly similar. So variance component option one is what was estimated from the subset of dry matter intake animals as well as their contemporaries. And so we see here that the genetic relationship between weaning weight and DMI is about 0.5. And the genetic relationship between DMI and post-weaning gain is 0.61. Our other option here, or option that we're looking at, is essentially kind of more closely mirroring the growth parameters of the heritability and genetic correlation parameters that we fit in the growth evaluation that was estimated from a larger subset of animals, but maintaining those relationships to DMI, what was estimated in the subpopulation. So kind of looking and going through with two initial options in terms of those for testing and through the validation phase. So some initial validation work has been done on these traits. So this is kind of some of the linear regression. So ideally, you would like to see kind of your regression to be as close to 1 as possible, as well as this bias estimate to be as close to 0 as possible. And so at least within the animals with dry matter intake, removing a certain portion of these records, we're seeing that these variance components are performing pretty equally well in terms of initial testing of those on a pedigree analysis. In terms of genetic evaluation model, again, this would be another 3-trait model that we would have. So similarly to what I explained for mature weight. For fixed effects included for dry matter intake, we would have a contemporary group, which would be a combination of the weaning contemporary group of the animal, as well as feed intake testing information, as well as the age when the animal goes on test, and all of the other effects are the same for weaning weight and post-weaning gain. So what this all means, or what this breaks down to, is this would be a difference in pounds of daily dry matter intake in the post-weaning growth period. It will not address differences in mature intake on pasture. And so I think some folks have thought that DMI may be a good link to that. I'm not aware of any research currently that shows a definitive link between those kind of post-weaning type feed intakes and more mature observations on pasture. The final trait that we're working on is heifer pregnancy. So as we think about the economics of heifer pregnancy, So really what we're looking at in terms of that trait is the number of females that will conceive and calve at 2 years of age. And so we all know the economic importance of fertility within beef cattle production. But in addition to that, there's also an opportunity cost that goes into heifer pregnancy as well, of having to retain more females if you have poor heifer pregnancy performance and not being able to sell those females earlier in life. As we look at phenotypes included in the evaluation, that would include exposure and calving information on females during their first breeding season. And traditionally, the way heifer pregnancy analyses have been conducted is looking at kind of a success or failure across the entirety of a standard breeding season. Let's say that's 60 days. So females would receive just one observation of successful or unsuccessful if they were having a calf. However, we're actually exploring kind of a more novel approach that differentiates these observations based on when that female has her calf within the breeding or within the calving season. And so the thought behind that is that via this random regression approach is that we can actually benefit or see those females that are going to calve earlier within the calving season because they conceive earlier in the calving seasons. And so that, kind of gives a boost or allows for a bit more of maybe additionally, not only are they going to get pregnant, but it allows us to push a bit harder on those females that are going to conceive early within the breeding season, which are obviously the ideal females that everyone wants. So the way this evaluation is going to work is females are going to have an observation within each week of a calving season. And so if they have had a calf at that point, they will receive a successful observation. If they have not, they will receive an unsuccessful observation. And so I provided a couple of examples here of what those observations would kind of look like in terms of females, depending on when they have their calves. And so again, really the main goal behind this is trying to give extra credit or better EPD values to females who calve earlier within that first breeding season. And so kind of some more information. This project is actually being conducted by Lane and in partnership with Colorado State University. And so they're working on the variance component estimation steps of this. And Lane has kind of shared some of those more on kind of a single breed subset basis. But all of that is looking pretty promising so far. One last thing that I kind of wanted to I guess touch on here is maybe some other projects that aren't new trait development, but other things that we're working on as well is optimization of production evaluation. So doing a good job of kind of going through and evaluating models to make sure that they're as good as what we can fit for each of the individual traits, as well as updating software and hardware as part of those evaluations. And really the goal there is to try to speed up those evaluations. And so kind of, I guess, obviously within that, the most logical place to start is with those longest running observations, but that's going to be kind of an ongoing project as well. And so with that, I know I went through a lot for a 30-minute time period first thing in the morning, but I'd like to open it up for any questions that folks may have.
Questions for Ryan Boldt?
Well, I've got one, Luke.
Yes.
So Ryan, effectively, I mean, if you're looking at that some separation around, which cycle that heifer's got in calf on, you're building a days to calving model or some equivalency into the heifer pregnancy.
Yeah, there would be. It's kind of a different approach to that. So I would assume within days to calving, that you would just fit difference between the heifer's birth date and then the birth date of her first calf. Is that kind of the phenotype within that one?
Not totally sure how it's calculated currently, Ryan, but it's effectively measuring the time between calving, so, or joining and calving.
Mhm. Yeah, so this would be a little bit different, but I guess some similarities there. You know, you could have within those that approach or a days to calving approach. You know, if you had potentially there your females that would actually receive your highest EPDs within a days to calving approach would be your latest born females that calve first, because they would have the shortest number of days. Whereas this would be within more of a contemporary group, just looking at that calving information. So we would include kind of age of the heifer within the evaluation to I guess account for some of those differences for age when the female herself was born, but a little bit different in terms of more just looking at the results on the I guess calving side. So I think to me, I guess in my opinion, it's probably a little bit cleaner way to look at it than a days to calving, and you would kind of be selecting more for those females that would calve earlier versus, you know, an extreme case in a days to calving of a female that was born late but happened to conceive early. So in my opinion, probably a little bit cleaner way to look at it, but there are definitely a lot of similarities there.
Just on the heifer pregnancy, is there any will any females be left out if there's human interference within, i.e. AI? Will they still be their data company?
Yeah, so I believe the question was females that were AI'd and then kind of naturally exposed. Is that, did I get that?
Yes.
Yeah, so you know, obviously within the contemporary group, if you have you know, a group that well, I'll kind of answer this two ways, I guess. So if you have two herds, let's say one that AIs and one that doesn't, within that week one observation or within that first observation, the means of those contemporary groups would likely be different. So if you had a herd that AI'd, you would assume that the mean number of animals or number of successes at week one would be higher than a group that doesn't AI, or that have, you know, the number of females that would conceive in week one. And so those differences like that, or those differences in management, that would actually be incorporated into the contemporary group effect, fit into that analysis. So within AI, you know, if you had a group that was AI and you had a 60% pregnancy rate, within that contemporary group, it would be deviations based on that. Whereas if you had natural service sires and, I don't know, let's say 20% of them were bred that first week, you would have a difference in your mean, but that would be included in that contemporary group effect.
So with animals, when you're recording the week of gestation or the week of birth, you can have sort of 2 weeks difference in gestation length. How does that fit in if you've got, you know, you've got females calving 2 weeks early and then for a week late? How do you filter out the noise and those figures when you're actually just marking week by week?
So I believe that question was differences in gestation length versus versus the way we would form observations for conceiving early.
Yes.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, this is kind of the best way that we would have. I mean, the cleanest data set that we would have for this would be, you know, obviously an exposure period, then ultrasound records on all of those females within that contemporary group. Now, obviously, that's probably not perfect either. You know, sometimes ultrasound fetal aging isn't 100% accurate, but it's probably pretty good. So, I mean, unfortunately, that's just kind of the way we're going to have to model that data without a, you know, a perfect way of being able to actually observe, you know, when each cow was being I guess, mated. Granted, you know, in the future, there's a lot of work that have been done in terms of activity monitors and things of that nature. That actually, for a trait like this, may actually have a big advantage in terms of data collection, because if we can mirror some of those events that they're able to capture on activity monitors, then that would probably add some accuracy to that in terms of being able to take out some of those gestation length factors. But kind of for the data that we have now and the data that's kind of traditionally been collected across the IGS breeds, I think that's going to just have to be an assumption that we're going to have to make for the time being.
Okay. Other questions for Ryan?
Brian, the change of the API with these new figures coming in, what's the, I mean, they will change, but there's a rapid change there coming in mature way, something being more accurately defined.
Luke, I didn't quite catch that one.
Will we see many changes in re-ranking of APIs, these new traits coming into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, kind of potentially, actually API does use I guess a genetic regression to kind of predict mature weight and DMI in it currently. And so there'll probably be some differences in terms of what would between those genetic regression, and that's actually driven by the measurements themselves. So that would be DMI data and mature weight data that would actually cause those differences versus the genetic regression. So theoretically, if we didn't have observations on those traits and ran a genetic evaluation with, I guess, just weaning weights and post-weaning gain, there wouldn't be any difference versus what's currently being done. However, by adding those data, we do, you know, expect to see some changes, because that's why we're wanting to conduct those genetic evaluations. The level of re-ranking, obviously, we won't know that until we're more in terms of a production model of those genetic evaluations. But with the strong genetic correlations to early in life growth traits, you know, I would expect those to be fairly robust to that, using kind of the current approach that is being used.
Thank you, Ryan. Yeah.
In relation to the mature cow weight, what size would that optimum window be once you do get the numbers for mature weight that you need within that breed? Like what sort of window are you going to give those mature weights for it not to be a punishment to be too light or a punishment to be too heavy?
Yeah, so I believe I understand the question, but if I don't, please correct me. So in terms of kind of directionality of the mature weight EPD, you know, a lower number would be more ideal because that would represent a smaller mature female. And so kind of as we think about, you know, economic weightings within selection indexes, generally that's generally the way kind of those economic weights are, is we would put a positive influence on earlier in life growth traits and then a negative influence on mature weight. Now, like I said, mature weight is kind of a little bit odd in that case. Is there's kind of two factors, because actually large mature females are more beneficial in terms of the salvage value side. But, you know, as you do economic analyses, the amount that you would gain from those larger females is usually less than what the additional cost is to feed those females. Did I answer that, your question?
So it was more to do with what, with the, like, with your mature weight, you can have something that's way too light and something that's way too heavy, both on different ends of the spectrum. So in that regard, like, you can't, like, I don't really understand how you could say mature weight lighter the better. Won't you have an optimum window for mature weight in economic terms that's going to be the best outcome for that farmer?
Yeah, so if you look at it from a single trait perspective, so you're saying that, you know, there's more of an intermediate optimum in terms of the mature weight instead of being on the tails of one way or another, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, you know, that's where some of this comes into in terms of selection indexes of, you know, as we look across the entire beef supply chain, are you going to be able with those smaller cows to save enough money versus what you would have to give up in terms of production and performance for other growth traits on those calves? And so, you know, really, as we look across those indexes, that does a better job of kind of optimizing that size. And so relative to early in life growth traits, you know, let's say our ideal animal, you know, is going to be an animal that grows really, really quickly through a year and a half of it, you know, year and a half, 2 years of age. And then from then on levels off and doesn't have or has below average mature weight within our herd. When you have all of those phenotypes contributing to those EPDs, you'll see those types of relationships emerge, and those really start to shine in terms of those indexes. And so in terms of percentile rankings within EPDs, you know, that would be up to each individual breed association in terms of how they want to set those. You know, most of the ones in the US are set to where lower values are better. In terms of individual selection decisions, however, that I guess depends on each individual ranch. You know, if you individually say, well, I want to maintain an average level of cow, then you can easily do that, you know, within your own individual herd by selecting those animals that are more in the middle. And I mean, if they're growing early, they may have above average weaning weight and yearling weight EPDs and average mature weight EPDs. Those animals are going to show up really high on an index, given that other traits in those indexes are favorable as well.
Thank you. Other questions for Ryan? I think we're good, Ryan. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Luke.